Hello and welcome to How to Win the Lottery Minnesota Module author interview. With us today, the author of Vestments, Mr. John Reimringer. Hello, John.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
I guess to start, I just want to talk about Minnesota with you. Are you originally a Minnesota guy?
That's a longer answer than you would suspect from this question. My my dad was from Minnesota, and his family went back to like the 1850s. In Minnesota, they used to own a grocery store and grocery store and bar in downtown St. Paul. So we went way back there. And I had never lived here. I was born in Fargo, North Dakota, and grew up in Kansas. And my wife and I moved up here right after my dad had died in 2001. And I immediately felt at home. So I'm the native who wasn't native and returned.
Yeah, you've got genealogical roots there, and it sort of
Right.
is in your bones and stuff.
Yes.
And the same way that the movie Fargo takes place largely in Minnesota, you're also got the Fargo, Minnesota crossover connection.
Yeah, I've got that. I'm surprised they didn't check in with me on that.
They should have.
Yeah.
This episode's going to come out in a couple of months because we're a little bit ahead on the recording, but I do want to know, because we're recording this in February, how you feel about the Twins this year? They looking good? They're not looking good.
I don't, I follow sports like at the playoffs and usually about one sport a year. So, and this year, though, lately it's been the NFL.
Okay.
So,
I am a pretty big Vikings fan, even though I live in New Jersey, and I have been pretty much in pain since I became a fan. Became a fan in '98 because my dad's friend was a Vikings fan, and I was like, I'll just give them a shot. And they drafted Randy Moss. They had an amazing year, collapsed in the playoffs as they are wont to do.
right.
And basically every time they've had a good run since then, I've just been in pain. So I am there with you. But I do want to give you credit. Like the way that you write about baseball in here, it makes you seem like a baseball guy, but maybe that's just like a Minnesota, North Dakota, like baseball just on TV kind of thing.
Well, at the time, I was following baseball much more closely than I am these days. And we've got a minor league team in St. Paul called the St. Paul Saints, who they have a long and storied history. I mean, it was an old franchise that went back to the American Association and so on. And God, who was it? Miles Wolff and Bill Veeck Jr. decided to found a independent minor league and kind of bring the fun back to the minor leagues. St. Paul was one of their flagship uh, franchises, and so they started the Northern League, and I think a number of other independent minor leagues spun off of that or came into being because of its popularity. They eventually grew to be part of another or became a uh, restarted the American Association, and there was the Independent American Association. And then recently they entered into an agreement as a Twins farm club. So I think they're their operations, the baseball operations now are the Twins, and the Saints are do the stadium and the entertainment and so on, which was always really good. And so when we first came up here, we lived within walking distance of the Saints Stadium, which was an old rundown municipal stadium that it kind of painted up, and they had what they called ushertainers, who we've got a big local theater scene in the Twin Cities, and so a lot of these people had acting experience, and there were these various characters who were wandering around the audience, and they had really great, consistently they had consistent writing on their shticks that they did between innings.
Love that.
It was always fun and kind of irreverent without ever being offensive. And as a writer, just the consistency of it was very appealing. And so my wife and I used to walk over to their games a lot, and it was a little like um, Annie Savoy walking to the Bull Durham Park, except colder.
Yeah, there's something about like really attaching to a minor league team, and that's like in some ways more fun than even following like the big team on TV and stuff.
Yeah, the big teams have gotten so it's so kind of canned, you
Yeah,
know.
sure.
It's so yeah, I do have baseball chops. I just haven't pursued them lately.
No, because I mean, I grew up a baseball fan. I'm still a baseball fan. Like baseball's my number one, and then football. Like I actually know Bob here through a fantasy baseball league. Like I met him through friends that he grew up with that are in the league with me, and so baseball is the way that like kind of, not for better or worse, just like connects us all together. And I think that there's something in the way that you write where that's also like there's a line that says, you know, the Twins are the thing to talk about when there's nothing else to talk about. And I think it's always, as a fan of baseball, it always strikes me as phony when people try to write about it when they don't like it, or they're just like, oh my God, this guy likes baseball and I write about it. But the way that you capture, like I was saying in the episode we just recorded, like the smell of infield grass and dirt, it's like, no, that's like a thing that like takes me back. Like that is a very specific scent that I can conjure up in my brain.
Well, that is good. And the Saints ballpark, the old Saints ballpark was just, it was charming. It was very intimate. You were right on top, wherever you were right on top of the field, right on top of the entertainers. I mean, pretty much everything in the baseball scene everything in the baseball scene in the novel was, you know, from the nun giving massages to, you know, whatever else was in that scene, which I haven't read in a while. Well, it was all taken from, you know, trips to the Saints parks. So, you know, it was very much, I had very much a love affair going with St. Paul and the Saints as I was reading the book, or as I was writing the book. So.
Yeah, I mean the book feels like super lived in is something that we talked about a lot. So from the baseball stuff to the Minnesota stuff to the Catholicism, like it really feels like not that you're writing about your life specifically, but it's like you're writing about stuff that you know about personally. At least that's how it felt. Was this a book that was like, did you do heavy research, or is this mostly personal experience, or how did you find this subject matter?
Well, I grew up Catholic in Topeka, which is a very different, you know, Topeka Catholic culture. I mean, Kansas is mostly Methodist. And so, you know, you grow up in Catholic culture in Topeka and you're kind of an outsider. We had that sort of 50s and 60s separate. I mean, there was a Catholic hospital and a Catholic funeral home
Right.
and so on. So, but I mean, I'd left the church in my late 20s, and I had been trying to write this. I'd been trying to expand this story into a novel, um, and we moved up here again, where I had the connections, and I immediately felt at home. But for a while, I was, you know, you're kind of stupid sometimes, and I'm sitting there thinking, how am I going to research this novel back in Topeka when I'm all the way up here in St. Paul? And then and then one morning I thought, you're in the middle of one of the most Catholic cities in the United States. It's like, so, but coming up here, I immediately felt at home in a way, in some ways I'd never felt at home in Kansas, even though we moved here when we were, when I was, even though we'd moved to Kansas when I was two. And I felt like I knew the people and I fit in. And, and so it was very much a love affair with St. Paul that I was writing, and I was grieving my dad at the time,
Sure.
and who, by the way, was very different from Joe Dressler.
I was going to say it's also a very like, and this is also in some ways a baseball thing. Like it's a very much a father and son's novel, right? From Otto to Jim's father, right? Like it's generational.
And again, I mean, it's one of those weird angles that you come at books from at times, because I'd had a roommate in college who was and I went to the University of Kansas, and this guy was from Kansas City, Kansas, which is kind of a rough little town. And he had a dad who was let me see, a fundamentalist bar fighter. And
I love that
this
phrasing.
this guy, and the dad was quite ferocious. I mean, it must have been something to grow up with him. He was always, he never hit me or anything, but I'd go home with my roommate on the weekend, and we'd get there, and his dad would be laying on the couch in front of the TV, smoking and drinking, and he'd be watching a TV preacher, the Reverend Gene Scott, if you've ever seen him.
No.
This guy was hilarious. I think there's a documentary out there on him. He was uh, God, he went to, I think maybe he was Ivy League educated, but he played a saxophone in his broadcasts, and he smoked big cigars, and he was just a complete character. And so my college buddy's dad would be laying on the couch arguing with Gene Scott and smoking and drinking, and then he'd go out to the bars and like as not get in a fight. And my roommate was a very nice guy who was also very tough. He was very athletic. And he went briefly after our college, he went to the American Baptist Seminary in Kansas City and then dropped out and became a cop, which he still is to this day.
Yeah, classic evolution. You go to seminary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I needed to write a short story for a workshop in grad school, and I started writing the story of my roommate and his dad, except I made them Catholic because I grew up Catholic, and
Sure.
it just went from there. And then eventually, of course, we get into, and that I don't, as a writer, you meet sometimes people who are, I don't even know how many times I saw my roommate's dad in my life, but you meet somebody who just really sticks in your
Hmm.
mind and then kind of grows into their own character. And Joe Dressler certainly did that in the book. I mean, it got to the point where if I had a scene that needed livening up, I would walk Joe in there because I knew he'd do something outrageous.
Yeah.
I didn't know what, but I knew he would once he got there.
And he always brought it.
Yeah.
I think there, because we were talking about in the episode that there's like an artistry to like his ability to get into fights but never actually get punished or prosecuted for them. Like he would know who to fight or where to fight, and maybe that's just you as the author not wanting to take away your catalyst, but like, oh no, he can't get arrested here because like we need him to get a fight like in a couple of pages from now or whatever. So maybe that adds to his artistry.
And I think, I mean, even though the book, When James is Young Man, is set in the early 90s because I'd moved it forward from my own similar age in the 70s. I mean, there was, when I was growing up, people got in bar fights and they didn't get arrested. They
Mhm.
Yeah.
just, unless somebody got badly hurt. And so I think it harks back to that time too.
We have a friend that's always trying to get in, like his goal. He like one of his life goals is to get into one of those bar fights, like a really like brutal one. And I don't think you can really do it anymore. I don't think like you'd really have to. I don't know. I think you'd get arrested, or the fight would get broken up too quickly, or people would have their phones out. I don't know. There's something about it that I don't. It seems like it belongs to a magical yesterday. The bar fight.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not something. I mean, you know, one fight in college in the bar of a parking lot was the closest I ever got to a bar fight, and I would have lost badly if a lot of people hadn't separated us.
Ah, you could
So,
still do it. Get back out there, man. It's never too late.
yeah, that's,
When you started writing the short story that eventually became this novel, like you mentioned that you were writing about your roommate and his dad. Like, what was it just their relationship? Or like, what was the kernel that began the story? Because you said you took a while to figure out how to expand it to a full text, but like, where did you begin with it?
it did start with the confrontation in James's house when he was home. But the kernel of the story was just I found it fascinating that my roommate, who was both very athletic and very tough and a very good storyteller and so on, and still had this very sensitive side and had this, real roughneck of a father who must have been hell to grow up with. And I just found their relationship really interesting. And for whatever reason, that, it took off when I started writing them.
There's also got to be something there about like priests being in sort of perpetual forgiveness mode, right? And you can always like, who better than a priest to forgive his father for all of those sins over a long period of time, right?
Yeah, and that was definitely something that ended up being kind of a uh, unspoken theme of the book was the whole Catholic concept of grace, the idea of undeserved forgiveness. And so the, you know, James is James by the end of the book, you know, makes an act of grace toward his father, I suppose you could say. And I tried to do that. I mean, as long as we're on Joe Dressler, I've had people say, to me, I love the book, but I could barely get through the first 100 pages because Joe Dressler is so awful. And I did that with him, I'd pull out, the most offensive things I
Yeah.
could to put them in his mouth. But part of that became actually I was trying to force an act of grace on the reader that you know you read this guy and he's terrible, and as you learn more and more about him, you learn more where that comes from, and in the end, you have to kind of forgive him too. So there was a theological component to the
Well,
book.
this is also, there's something that I took I have my MFA in creative and creative writing. And something that a teacher told me in a nonfiction writing course was that like the only reason a character is ever not sympathetic is because you haven't told enough of their story yet. So once you get enough of anybody and you find the reasons why they are who they are, it doesn't matter who that person is, but you'll uncover the stuff that made them act poorly. So, as we move on, we learn that about him.
Right, yeah, yeah.
At what point, I'm going to phrase this question within the compliment sandwich or however you want to phrase this, but when we were recording the episode, we were talking about the multiple timelines and how they inform one another. Like, at what point in the process of writing this did you decide that it can't just be linear, that there has to be another timeline going on? Was that early? Was that later? Was that the thing that unlocked it? Like, where did that come in the journey?
It came fairly early, and I've only completed, I mean, honestly, I've only completed a handful of stories and published them, and this novel, and a couple of them were pretty straightforward chronological, and a couple of them just from the very beginning had a complicated timeline to them. This one did as well, and at some point, I've had people remark on the timeline, and it just kind of fell out as it did. Um, and I can't bring a lot of insight
No, it
into.
works. You don't really
Yeah,
need
Just
to.
magic.
It just
Yeah.
works.
I think one of the biggest parts for me was the whole priest section because that ended up being a fair part of the book, and it became something on its own. I had wanted to get out of the Twin Cities for a little while and put James in a place where he would feel really isolated because that's something I'd understood from research on the priesthood that even any priest feels isolated. And if you move, and I wanted to heighten that by setting James out and in a small town and away from his milieu.
Yeah, that felt like one of the big takeaways for me was the not the like the celibacy, because people know that if you know like a few things about the Catholic Church, you know that that's part of it, but just the way that you describe the overall like loneliness for companionship. But the other thing that really sort of surprised me here, and it shouldn't, but it's just a thing that I never spent time thinking about, is just like how being a priest is a job, and you can be good at it, you can be bad at it. Like, it's not about being devout, it's not about believing in God or like being a good preacher or whatever, but like, there's so much to it. Like, you have to play the game, and like Mick sins and falls from grace or whatever, but like basically gets a promotion because he knows how to play the game better, right? So I think that was a particularly interesting element that I found here, and I'm wondering if that was a thing that you sort of came upon in your research, or that's a thing that you always knew about, or where that sort of life lesson came from.
I think I knew it on some level because, again, growing up Catholic, my dad had a good friend, Father. In fact, Father Phil in the novel is based on him, who was a Veterans Administration priest and a good bowler and golfer and drinker and smoker. And so I always knew Father Phil is the guy who showed up in the golf shirt with the ball cap on and, had a few cigarettes and drinks with my dad. But then when I was researching for the book, I read a lot on priests because, you can't just casually write a priest.
Right.
Right.
And and so I had read a autobiography of a bishop, former bishop in St. Paul, a guy named James Shannon, who was widely expected to become an archbishop and maybe even a cardinal, and broke with the church in the late 60s over Pope Paul's decision on birth control, and left the church and went off and worked in corporations, and
Wow.
generally ended up running whatever part of a corporation he was part of. And reading his autobiography, he didn't strike me as particularly spiritual. He was an organization guy, and he was great at running those kind of things. And I'd read the biography of John Ireland, who was the great Catholic Archbishop of St. Paul and kind of a national figure in his time. And by the same token, he didn't seem particularly spiritual. He was a politician. And so, that kind of from the original Father Phil through these biographies and so on that I read, and I read a lot of kind of oral histories of priests, a study done on the first 5 years of the priesthood, and they had a lot of interviews with people where guys are talking about, like, I don't know how I'm going to retire because the church doesn't pay that well, or, and so you did get that sense that, yeah, in the end, it's another job.
I think the other really like demystifying thing to me that I had never thought about really, even though one thing that I like about the writing is that like once it lays out what's true, you think like, oh, of course, that's obviously true. But that priests have this entire life and they don't always want to talk about God, and they don't like he doesn't want to wear the collar at the wedding because he knows that people will try to talk about him with, theological matters instead of just being like, hey, what's up, man? Or when he's playing the pickup game of basketball against the kids and they're cursing. And then later he says like that he happens to be a priest and they're all like, oh, sorry. And he doesn't want to be treated like that because he wants to just be a regular guy, but everyone treats him differently because he's a priest. I never considered that might be true about priests in my life.
Yeah, and I've had both. I mean, I ran the book by once it was pretty much done. I ran the book by a couple of priests, and to see whether they found it convincing, and they did. But both and in fact, one of them, said you really got that part. But I've had Protestant ministers who've read the book come up to me and say, "Yeah, this is like what it's like being in the ministry. You're living in a fishbowl." And I think that's probably heightened for priests since they don't have families.
Right.
And as the church has become less popular, I mean, when I grew up, there were like 3 priests in our parish, and they at least had each other's company. And now so often you see priests are alone,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, at least these guys have, each other to play poker with and drink with and talk about baseball with and whatever. So even if they don't have the companionship that they maybe desire or long for or whatever, they at least have Friday nights at the bar playing poker or something.
That is another thing that I thought about in when I was reading it, because I went to Catholic school until 5th grade, and all the priests that I knew and the priests that knew my parents' stuff, they all drank and smoked quite a bit. I currently work at a yeshiva, so I'm around rabbis all the time, and none of them smoke or drink or anything like that. And I don't know, like that might be an evolution of the difference between being around people in the 1990s and being around people in 2026. I think that's probably what it is. Because like, I'd imagine if you go back to the 90s, those rabbis are drinking and smoking all the time too.
Well, also there was no Twitter or something where like people could walk into a bar and film like a bunch of priests like playing poker and smoking and drinking, be like, what is going on here, right? So
right, yeah, and so it's I think it's that evolution of the culture. I suspect that if I went out and hung out with a bunch of young priests today, that vibe would be very different. you know. Although I still think there's that sort of machismo to it that goes with just like I may be celibate, I may be living alone, but by gosh, I like football and
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah, for sure. Oh, that's so funny to think about.
You mentioned in an email to me that you were thinking about other, what else you could write about. And I think you mentioned, if I'm able to say here, and we can cut it out if not, that you were maybe working on like a prequel to this. But like, are there other stories in this world, or characters, or angles, or scenes, or topics that you'd want to explore more?
What I originally had in mind, and I really honestly don't think it's going to happen now, but so I'm free to talk about it. I've got about halfway through, maybe a third of the way, because it was growing into quite a monster, through a prequel that was set in St. Paul during the 20s and 30s,
Whoa.
and you were going to see as a side character in that, you were going to see the grandfather from Vestments,
Okay.
and some people. But St. Paul in the 20s and 30s was a really interesting town. There's a great book out there on it called John Dillinger Slept Here. Okay. And in the starting I think starting in the 20s, they had something called the O'Connor system in St. Paul, which was named after a corrupt police chief. And the way the O'Connor system worked was if you were a bank robber and you came to St. Paul, as long as you registered with the cops and paid them a bribe and didn't rob any banks in St. Paul, they left you alone.
Amazing.
Yeah, that
And
rules. Bring it
and
back.
as time went on, this grew, I mean, to the point where like they would tip people off if the FBI was coming. And this happened throughout the 20s and 30s. And there was a time where, like, I think most of the bank robberies in the country happened in the upper Midwest for a period of years, but none happened in St. Paul. And so you had, I mean, John Dillinger was in town. His one of his top gunmen, Homer Van Meter, was essentially, they think he was assassinated by the police, but in a downtown alley in St. Paul. Um, and you had Creepy Carpus was here, Ma Barker and her boys, and they were all renting apartments in St. Paul, out at White Bear Lake and so on. And so I thought that would be a fascinating world to explore. And like I say, I got about 250 pages into it, and I just stopped writing a few years ago.
Ugh.
And I keep thinking I would like to come back to it. And I don't know whether I will or not. But it was also, it was during Prohibition. It was the speakeasies. My dad had grown up here then. He was born in 1914. And I've got one story I've got to tell because it fits in with that time and the bar fighting and John Dillinger Slept Here. When my dad was old, sometimes he'd have trouble with his jaw. And and my dad was not a Joe Dressler type. He was like, when he got out of high school, in 1932, he was like 6'3" and 140 pounds. But he liked to drink and he liked to go out with his buddies to the speakeasies and so on. And he had gotten into a fight and he told me about this when his jaw locked up. And he said, oh, yeah, yeah. I was 18. I got in a fight with a bouncer in a speakeasy. This guy was a former heavyweight boxer who killed two people with his bare hands. And I never, he never put me on the floor for good. But by the time he was done with me, he'd broken my jaw in three places and I drank through a straw or I ate through a straw for a month. And, and you just like, that's one of those stories your
Mm-hmm.
dad tells. And you're like, well, that's interesting. I wonder whether it really happened and so on. And at some point when I was reading John Dillinger Slept Here, they were talking about one of the kind of notorious gangster bars in St. Paul. And the guy who actually owned it had got busted and needed a front man to run it for him. And it was something I'm probably getting the name wrong, but it was like, the passage was something like George Hurley, a former boxer who had twice been charged with murder. And I thought, that's the guy who beat the shit out of my dad. Yeah.
So you're
So,
telling us that Joe Dressler really punched Bob Dylan in the nose, is what you're saying.
yeah, there you go. That's it.
I do want to, if I can go back to the previous thing, encourage you to pick up that book again, because Bob over here has made modules for all 50 states, which seems like an incredible Herculean task, which is how we came upon your work. And so the Vestments we were talking about is really one of the highlights of just a book that we had not heard of before, that looking for Minnesota books and found this, and we both really loved it. And our friend Meg, who has a question for you a little bit, like, she loved it as well. But within the context of the Minnesota module, not only just encouraging you to write more, because we'd love to read more of what you write, but are there other, in addition to John Dillinger's Slept Here, are there other books, probably fiction more than nonfiction, but anything, we'll take whatever, that you would recommend as sort of like hallmarks of the Minnesota genre, or like the setting? Like, if you were putting together a list of books that sort of exemplify or talk about like life in Minnesota, either rural or suburban or whatever, what would you pick?
Well, it's quite varied. And you've hit on a couple of them with, I mean, Faith Sullivan wrote quite a series of Minnesota
Mm-hmm.
novels. There's Peter Guy, whose first novel came out about the same time mine did, has published four novels, and a lot of them are set up on Superior and the North Shore. And so he catches it. I've got a colleague, Tom Maltman, who has published, I think his fourth novel has just come out and is up for it's Ashes to Ashes, is up for the Minnesota Book Award right now.
Nice.
But his original book, The Nightbirds, was set during the time of the 1862 Sioux Uprising, and also 14 years, I think it was 14 years later, during the James Younger gang's robbery or attempt to rob the bank in Northfield. And so, and Tom's book, The
Oh,
Nightbirds, is just beautiful. He really, uh, he does the cultural confrontation between the settlers and the Native Americans. Just, he handles it beautifully, and you see this tragedy where people with good intent and people with bad intent, everything just kind of spirals out of control. Uh, so that's one I definitely
Nice.
recommend.
okay. Yeah, well, we'll put that on the list. It just occurred to me that I'd seen a movie called The Great Minnesota Northfield Raid, and I assume that that's what that's about. What you were just talking about. Yeah, it
Right,
triggered
yeah.
something in my brain.
Yeah, Jesse James and Cole Younger and their brothers went up to try to rob Northfield, and got shot to bits.
Yeah.
The Jameses escaped, and the Youngers ended up in prison.
There is another section in your book that describes St. Paul as the last East Coast city. And then I guess then Minneapolis is or not East Coast, but the last Eastern city, and then Minneapolis is the West city. And I think you say that, or the character says that the difference between Minneapolis and St. Paul is that in Minneapolis they would hire an interior decorator to make it look 50 years older, and in St. Paul they just haven't cleaned anything for 50 years.
Yeah.
Like, what is that? Like, what's the distinction there between the East and the West? How do you draw the major differences between those two cities, aside from that one note?
Well, I mean, technically speaking, since the cities are split by the Mississippi,
Mm-hmm.
you know, St. Paul is the last Eastern city if you're going by. But there's another book out there, and it's nonfiction, by a local historian named Mary Lethard Winger, called "Claiming the City." God, what is it? Politics, faith, and anyway, largely about St. Paul, but I read it early in my time up here, and it really contributed to the character of St. Paul in Vestments, because Mary Lethard Winger really kind of distinguished between the two cities. And Minneapolis was very much more, had a national market. They were the grain milling capital. of the upper Midwest, and so they tended to become much more corporate and at the same time breed many more activists. And so you had unions and strikes and so on. And St. Paul had which had quickly become kind of the older, dowdier sister, had always had kind of a very close-knit business community that had a smaller customer base, and so they tended to work a lot more with the working class. The owner class, the working class got along better, I suppose you could say. It's just played out. I mean, it still plays out today with what's been going on here the last couple months. I mean, Minneapolis, and we've done it too in St. Paul, but Minneapolis is the place where they've trained 30,000 people with whistles to be legal witnesses
Right.
and get out and film things and so on. And we do have people doing that in St. Paul, but it's and also I think Minneapolis got the bore the brunt of ICE because it's the splashier city to if you want to make a run at secret police, to debut them, I suppose.
Yeah, it's the name, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. If or is it more? Does Minneapolis have like a greater immigrant community and things like that, or is it?
It varies. Minneapolis, most of the Somali
Right.
people are in Minneapolis. A lot of Native Americans, in particular, in Minneapolis. St. Paul's got a big Hmong community of refugees from Vietnam who would, the mountain people would help the U.S. Army there, and so, I mean, they both got large immigrant communities. St. Paul, West St. Paul is an old Mexican neighborhood, and so a little bit, but Minneapolis is it's the glitzier, hipper of the two cities. And
If I'm taking a plane into Minnesota and I'm going on vacation to Minnesota, am I going to St. Paul or am I going to Minneapolis? What do you think? What am I going to enjoy more?
I'd have to know you better, but if you come here, I'll take you around.
Yeah, we can get in a bar fight. Let's go. Let's find some guys we don't like and beat them up.
Here's a question for you, John. In terms of his vacation there, I went to, because I'm a Vikings fan, as I said. I've been up there for 2 different games, one of which they lost, one of which they won. But I went to both bars that say that they invented the Juicy Lucy. I went to Matt's and I went to the 5-8 Club. Have you been to both of those? Do you have a preference between those two?
I have been to Matt's and I like Matt's. We have our own Juicy Lucy
In St.
type
Paul?
bar in St. Paul,
Okay.
and it's called the Nook, and it's just a little hole in the wall. It's across the street from the Cretan Durham Hall Catholic High School, and they call their burger with the cheese in the middle the Juicy Nookie.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And so, and the Nook is my favorite place. Although I have been to Matt's, I don't think I've been to the other.
I liked Matt's a lot. The 5-8 Club was more felt more kind of like a chain to me. Matt's, I didn't wait long enough to let the cheese cool down, so it kind of burned me. So I literally burned my experience by eating that one too quickly. But I liked them both. I mean, with the burger with the cheese in the middle, it's brilliant.
I've never heard of this before. This is the first that I'm ever.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's a thing.
I've only ever been to Minnesota, to the airport on the way from Los Angeles to New Jersey.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the only time.
So the definition of flyover country for you.
Well, another thing that we learned, because I got married in the fall and I had my bachelor party in Cleveland because I want to go to every baseball stadium. There were 5 that I want to go to that I have not been to. And my wife has no interest in going to Cleveland. So I'm like, okay, we'll go to Cleveland. And while we were at a Guardians game, I had a Hamm's beer. So I got very excited when you mentioned Hamm's in the text. And I guess is Hamm's just like the Midwest sort of Budweiser? Like, does Hamm's have a reputation in bars in the Midwest? Because I never heard of it before and I liked it. And then I got really excited when you mentioned it in the text.
Yeah, not so much anymore, but I mean, Hamm's was one of the major breweries in St. Paul. And in fact, to tie into something earlier, the gangsters in St. Paul kind of started to come to an end when they got greedy and kidnapped a couple of prominent citizens. One of them was the guy was the heir to the Ham's fortune.
Ooh.
And he actually turned out to be a really great kidnapping victim. It turned out he was relaxed. He got along with the gangsters, and eventually got ransomed. And then they kidnapped a guy named Otto Bremner, who was the head of a bank in St. Paul, which is the bank is still around. But Bremner turned out to be a pain in the ass, and was, always whining and complaining and scared, and the gangsters decided, well, we don't want to kidnap a guy like him again.
Yeah, my boss calls that the airplane test. Like when he's thinking about taking on a new client, it's like, do I want to sit next to this guy in an airplane for 6 hours? Like now I can call it the kidnapping test. Like, would I want to kidnap this guy for a weekend? And then it kind of seems like an asshole. Like I don't want to keep him around for 3 days.
Exactly. I think that would be a good analogy to draw.
It sounds to me like you're thinking enough about this 1930s St. Paul stuff that you got to dig that book out and get back to it.
Yeah.
It's all there for you.
I'm entering phased retirement now, so maybe it does go that way.
Are you a full-time teacher?
I'm full-time at Normandale Community College in Bloomington.
Do you find it hard to write while you're teaching? Is that what it is? And like, because teaching obviously is a full-time job, and then writing is also kind of a full-time job. Is that one of the things?
That's certainly, obviously there are all kinds of people who have managed to successfully write and teach at the same time, but it is quite a challenge. And you get into writing because you love reading great literature and you love books and so on. And then, if you end up being a community college teacher, and I love teaching community college and I love my students, but you end up, teaching freshman comp to students who were required to take it. And
I got 10 years of it. I did it for 10 years.
Yeah, there you go. And reading their essays, which are sometimes wonderful and perceptive, but are not Hemingway.
Certainly.
So yeah, I think it certainly.
Are you, and this is getting way off topic, but because you're currently teaching college, and I'm teaching high school now and no longer have to teach comp and things like that, are you finding yourself essentially in the position of a police officer right now, sort of policing AI constantly?
Oh God, yeah. Yeah. And finally what it got, because there's no good way to catch it, but AI at this point is, when it writes college essays, at least it writes in generalities, and it's not getting into specific paraphrases or quotes from the stories, from the articles that I'm assigning that it's purporting to write about. So I told my classes this at the start of the semester, I don't have any good way to prove, you've used AI, except sometimes it will write on completely the wrong subject.
Yeah.
But I've redone my grading rubric so that AI and people who write like AI will get a failing grade.
Okay, that's probably the best defense that you can do.
And that's where we are right now. And if AI gets to the point where it can write a good college essay, what the heck? Maybe I'll just start having AI grade it, and then I'll have a lot of time for writing.
Yeah, you just collect that paycheck and then write that 1930s St. Paul novel.
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time reading and thinking about it because that's sort of the line of work that I'm in, and it's basically been trained on everything it can be trained on. So I don't know that it's ever going to get better at that specific use case. So as long as they're not, I mean, if your students were better at using the tools, they would be prompting it better and adding more specific things. But if they're not going so far as to like tell it what to write about, then they don't deserve a passing grade anyway. So what can you do?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess if they get good enough at using it, and it gets good enough, we've got it.
Yeah, man, that's kind of a bummer. But
Vestments was actually one of the many, many, many books that we used to train AI.
There you go.
So, and my wife was complaining about the AI, AI take at the top of every Google search you do nowadays. And
Hmm.
she says, I mean, I feel like I'm being lectured if I ask, you know, what the best version of Blade Runner is. It's going to say, well, best is subjective.
Yes.
And, but some people say this and some people say that. And I looked at her and I said, well, if it says the fuck you want to know for, then Joe Dressler came in there. That's the part where AI got trained by Joe Dressler. So
I have go ahead. You were.
My last like thing that I've been thinking about this for this entire interview is, did your college friend did he read Vestments, and like what does he think about it?
I have never heard from him what he thought about it.
Oh man.
I dropped it into an I dropped mentioned in an email once that while Joe had become his own character, it was very much based on my college roommate's dad, and he never answered it.
Uh-oh.
And it's hard to say because I think when you write a character, the Betty character is based on my high school girlfriend.
We love Betty. We
And
talked about loving Betty a lot.
I love Betty a lot too. And when I wrote her, I thought, wow, this is I mean, the a lot of things that happened between them never happened with my
Sure.
high school girlfriend and I, but you know, my high school girlfriend Michelle was the kernel of Betty. And so during that time, it's like, I thought that at the end that I had this kind of portrait of Michelle. And then through Facebook, we got back in touch, and she actually was in the Twin Cities for a convention, and my wife and I had her over for dinner. And I realized at this point, that Betty was like 20% Michelle and 20% my wife and
Hmm.
60% her own character by
Sure.
the time I got done with it. So, I mean, it may be that if my college roommate ever read the book, he looked at it and said, I don't get this as my dad.
While we're on the topic of Betty, I do want to ask a question. We can cut this out if you don't want to talk about this, but it's an interesting question from our friend Meg.
I would say it's a weird question.
It's maybe a weird question, but I think specifically, and maybe we know a reason why the answer might be no. But our friend Meg, who reads every book that we read and writes into every episode, and also really liked Vestments, was wondering if you were ever tempted to make the novel more erotic, because it's about sex and sin, but it's kind of the best way I can describe it is that there's the movie with Zac Efron called Me and Orson Welles, where they talk about quadruple spacing. Like in old novels, they would quadruple space, and your mind would fill in the blanks of like what it goes on. But like there's kissing, but then there's like all of a sudden he wakes up in bed next to Betty. You're like, oh, I know what happened, but like you don't see what happened. So Meg was wondering if you ever had the temptation to make it more erotic, or if this was just like a better left implied.
I think it was a better left implied. And I also think by the time I was writing this, I mean, erotic's been done, right? We've been through the 70s, we've been through Henry Miller,
Sure.
we've been through, we've been through the gratuitous breasts of the 80s films. And so by the time I got there, I was just like, yeah, it's better left implied. So, but that is I mean, I've never gotten that question
Well, I
before, so
think
that's a new one.
there's something I think that is inherent. I don't know if it's inherent, but there is that like idea of the priest as an erotic figure, because your mind fills in the blank space of like all the sex that they're not having, right?
Hmm.
So and there's also the issue with Diana, where she's like fulfilling some like Freudian aspects. So like there is like sexuality is all threaded through the entire novel, but there's no like we're not getting any scenes where it's like, we're going at it for 10 pages or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. I guess I mean, I'd like to say that I just kind of repressed the sexuality beneath the surface so that everybody could have that experience. But no,
I was wondering if maybe you're
Yeah,
like,
fair
as you're
enough.
writing, you're like, oh, it's like my high school girlfriend. Like you don't want to write about. And then she's like, oh, it's like my wife. Like I don't want to share that. And then all of a sudden it's just like, well, now it's Betty's his own character. Like I don't want to. And I wonder if like any of part of you was just like, I can't share these personal experiences that I've had, even though like Jim is not me. Betty is a girl that I know and have loved or currently love or whatever. So I don't know.
I think that does play in somewhat. I mean, if you read enough of a writer and these sexual tropes come up in their writing, I mean, Hemingway's androgyny
Sure.
and his love of, cutting and dyeing his hair to match his wife and so on, that's evident very early. And as you continue to read him, you start to realize that, yeah, this is this guy. And I can think of other writers where, I've read them and seen the Irish writer John McGahern had some sex scenes where you thought, this happened to him. And, I didn't knowingly withhold, but I think I was,
Sure.
yeah, I don't know whether you want to go into that area.
I read that much maligned, or not, I guess not maligned, but it got pulled from the shelves, Blake Bailey biography of Philip Roth. And one of the like funny things about it was that after Portnoy's complaint came out, every single time Philip Roth ate in a restaurant, someone walking by him would go like, I hope you're not having the liver, right? Because there's a scene where he masturbates into the liver. So like, yeah, I wouldn't wish that on anybody to have like the rest of the, like every time they go out to eat, having someone just be like, hey, remember that scene in your book where you did the thing? So yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's better left unsaid, this stuff.
This is my legacy. I'm going to put it on my tombstone. Yes, I'm having the liver. You know?
I do love that the Garden of Eden, the final Hemingway novel that never gets like that book is amazing, and it sort of got shat on, right? I think people like don't like it.
But and it very much was about, the time when he was drifting apart from Hadley and getting together with Pauline.
Yeah.
And, so there's, I think, a lot of autobiography in there as there wasn't so much a Hemingway.
Yeah. What a great book, though.
yeah.
Man, I love that book.
Yeah. Yeah, that was.
Something that we ask some people, I don't know. We didn't look it up. Do you have a Wikipedia page? Do you know?
Not last I checked.
Oh, all right. Something that we do sometimes is we ask people if they want us to lie on their Wikipedia page about anything, because we can be used as a source. So if you wanted to tell us that you were like 6'8" or something like that, we could use this interview as a source and then go edit your Wikipedia page to tell a lie about you that you'd like to be told.
Right. Yeah,
So
I can't think of, and I mean, James is kind of I'm a terrible athlete, and even though I've been was in a few fights like any young guy, mostly they got broken up early, and that was good. So James is in some ways is a total fantasy, as a guy who can play basketball and pitch, you know,
Hmm.
pitch in baseball and so on. And so, or whatever he was doing, he may have been a first baseman.
maybe
Anyway,
we'll edit that. Maybe once you get that Wikipedia page up, maybe we'll edit it to say that you threw a no-hitter in high school or something like that.
yeah, there we go.
Okay.
So now
All right.
a similar question that we basically have stopped asking, because when we posted these episodes online, we got in big trouble in terms of copyright music. But we used to ask authors that we interviewed if there was an outro song that they wanted to hear as the episode ends. So you could also think about it in terms of baseball. Like if you are like a closing pitch and you're coming in from the bullpen, like you want some like psych up music to get you like amped to come to the mound, or just simply in this episode, what you want to have it end. Is there like a song that you think embodies either you or Vestments or St. Paul, or like, is there a song that you want to associate with this text? We can't put it in there anymore because we get yelled at, but people can
Yeah.
imagine it.
I did a whole playlist for a, a website called, I think it was Large Hearted Boy. Again, this was 15 years ago. So, I filled that with songs. One was Creedence Clearwater Revival's Center Field.
Okay.
Um, uh, and I'll do another aside, and you can cut this if you need to. The one thing about Vestments, my wife published her first book of poetry while I was working on Vestments, and she had like a line from a Bob Dylan song in it from Mass Avenue.
Okay.
And so her publisher wrote Dylan or Dylan's music company and said, "Can we have permission to use these words?" And Dylan, or the music company, I shouldn't put it all on Bob, Dylan's music company said, "Well, sure, but that'll be $200."
Ah.
And my wife's indie press publisher wrote back and said, "Look, she's only got $1,000 advance for the whole damn book. Could you cut it?
Yeah.
Could you And they said, "Okay, only 100." And so she paid it out of her advance. And I was really pissed at this. So that's where the whole scene where Joe Dressler breaks Bob Dylan's nose
Oh, I love
That's
that.
really funny.
Good. Yeah.
comes from.
a
And
Minnesota
Dylan
boy.
was he was in Dinky Town at that time. I looked it up, made sure the dates worked and stuff. And I thought, I may not be able to use his lyrics, but I can break his nose.
So I found, while you were telling that story, I found the large-hearted boy playlist you made. You got Bruce Springsteen, Adam Raised a Cain. You got John Prine's Angel from Montgomery. Another Springsteen, She's the One. You do have a Bob Dylan song on here, Tangled Up in Blue. Superman by R.E.M. This is a good list, though. Like, this is a fun... Without even knowing, we had a Vestments playlist already queued in. Maybe we'll link this in the show notes.
Yeah.
But this
Yeah.
is a good background, like Americana,
Cool.
to listen to while you're thinking about Vestments.
Yeah, I think so far as the father-son relationship goes, the Adam Raised a Cain is,
Yeah.
right on. And She's the One so far as the Betty relationship.
Okay. I love it. That feels like a good place to end things,
Yeah,
right?
the last question I have is there any other writing that you have out there that if people who listen to this, who love Vestments, that they want to read more of what you've written? Do you have other stuff published that's accessible either online or in print?
I published 4 short stories in small literary I think the largest was Carolina Quarterly, and I don't think any of them are online.
Oh, okay. Well,
I-
I'll tell you what. I published a bunch of stuff on online literary journals, and all of those online literary journals have since shuttered their the website's gone down. So there's no way to get any of those stories that I published. So
all I can say is that if you Google John Reimringer, you will find all there is to find about me.
Are you the only John Reimringer in the world?
There are a bunch of Reimringers on the French-German border.
Okay.
But that's it. And there are a few in the U.S., but not many. And, I can't, if I ever do anything sordid or embarrassing, there's no deniability about it.
I get it. Well, if you do write that prequel or you write, anything else, please reach out to us because we'd love to read it and talk to you about it again because this book was fine.
We loved it.
We really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for writing it and for joining us tonight.
And if we come to St. Paul, we will get in that bar fight. We'll find you and we'll go to a bar and we'll punch some people in the head.
And I'll smash a juicy nookie in Bob's face.
Yeah.
No. I will take you to the nicest bars in St. Paul.
All right. That sounds good
you.
too. That sounds good too. All right. Thanks, John.
This was really enjoyable. Thank you. I was really nervous about it because I haven't talked about this book in over a decade. And I'm like, so.
Yeah, no, nothing to be nervous about. We love it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.